Okay, so now we're ready to talk about the next division, which is like the sympathetic parasympathetic stuff we left off with on Tuesday, which were both associated with automatic or involuntary control. Okay, but specifically here we're talking about what we call the enteric nervous system, a third division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. This is associated with involuntary control, so it's automatically done for us. And we're talking about controlling our gastrointestinal tract, or GI tract for short, which involves stomach and intestines, small and large intestines. Okay, this is a network, it's an extensive network of neurons confined to the wall of our GI tract. So these neurons help regulate activity of the smooth muscles and glands of our tract. So like causing your stomach to contract and swirl around the food that we've eaten for lunch, release of juices, gastric juice, which is loaded with different enzymes and hydrochloric acid and other stuff that we use to digest and break down our food. Although our enteric nervous system can function independently, it does communicate with and is regulated by the other branches of the ANS, which once again are the sympathetic parasympathetic divisions. One of these two systems or divisions is going to activate and enhance activity of the ENS. Which one do you think it is? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Which one helps promote digestion? Probably the one that says the rest and digest, right? Okay. Whereas the sympathetic actually inhibits it, which should make sense. We talked about how the sympathetic produces that fight or flight response. We use the example, I'll use the example of running from a bear. Do you think it's important to digest the candy bar you had as a snack when you're running from a bear? Or should you be dedicating all of your resources, all of your energy to running away from that bear or fighting that bear? And hopefully common sense tells you that we're not worried about digesting the candy bar at that point. The ENS sensory neurons that are going to be sensitive and respond to changes within the GI tract are going to monitor things like the stretch of our stomach, the pH of our stomach, that kind of stuff. And then they use motor neurons to control digestive function, which once again is going to cause secretion of glands and contraction and relaxation of certain muscles. Okay, we'll talk more about the ENS later on in the semester, right when we talk about the digestive system, is when we'll really get into that. So to kind of wrap up, both the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system include cells that form incoming and outgoing pathways. So think of it like a two-lane highway where you got traffic going in both directions. We can describe the afferent division as all the incoming information, or we can often classify it as a sensory pathway. Okay. And we're always talking about it in relationship to the central nervous system, which once again, remember central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord. Okay. It's what these blue arrows are showing you here. Notice they're pointing towards our central nervous system, coming from our somatic senses, which are things like our, itch and tickle, hot and cold sensations in our skin. We've also got, sensory information coming from muscles and tendons and that kind of stuff. And then like vision and hearing and balance, those are all sending in signals as well, providing input. Okay. So we use the term sensory and afferent kind of interchangeably, whereas the efferent or motor pathway is all the outgoing information, okay, which if you notice there, the efferent division, providing motor output. We've got the somatic, which we learned the other day, controls skeletal muscle in a voluntary manner. You have the autonomic or automatic nervous system, as I like to call it, with the three divisions: sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest, and then the enteric, which is specific to the digestive system. If I go back to this page, we talked about the functions of the nervous system. Okay, we said that the sensory function was performed by sensory afferent neurons, whereas the motor function was performed by motor or efferent neurons. Now you can see why or where those terms come from. So you'll see sensory and afferent kind of used interchangeably. Motor and efferent pretty much used interchangeably. Speaking of neurons, let's talk about them right now. Described as excitable cells because they exhibit electrical excitability. A very important property that we've actually discussed just a little bit already, all the way back to just 2 days ago when we were talking about resting membrane potential, how cells, which neurons are cells, but how cells have that negative 60 millivolt at rest. At least that's what an average typical cell would find and have. Okay. But then when channels open up and allow ions to flow in or out, that number could change. Remember us talking about that the other day? Hopefully, you just had your test over that. Okay. Electrical excitability refers to the ability of neurons to respond to a stimulus, converting it into an actual potential. All of it relates to moving ions. Neurons conduct impulses that make possible all those nervous system functions that we were just talking about: sensory function, motor function, and the integrative function. Essentially, we can say that neurons are the wiring of the body, and they're made up of the following structures. Okay, I'll kind of use this illustration to describe them. The first, what we kind of call the control center of a neuron, is its cell body. The cell body or soma contains a single nucleus, the cytoplasm, which contains mitochondria, lysosomes, Golgi, RER, which have a fancier way to describe them in neurons, and the cell bodies, and a cytoskeleton. Okay. So all those organelles that we've been discussing, and you just had your test over. Extending off of the cell body are two types of what we call nerve fibers. What we call dendrites are these things that look like tree branches coming off, and a long, relatively unbranched, what we call axon. Dendrites are described as the primary site for receiving signals from other neurons. So this is where a neuron can send a signal to another neuron, and that other neuron, this is where they would be receiving that signal. Okay. Dendrites are also sites of signal receiving. Doesn't necessarily have to be from a neuron. Okay, as we'll talk about here later in this unit. Axons or nerve fibers are cylindrical and relatively unbranched fibers conducting nerve signals to points remote from the cell body. The axon extends from a tapered portion of the cell body called the axon hillock, is where the cell body basically starts to skinny up and form into this long wired structure. Right in here, doesn't show it in this illustration because it's just a really simplified image, is a region called the trigger zone, which is where an actual potential actually is triggered, hence the name. And then it fires, and think of it like, burning, firecracker down the fuse. The actual potential is going to go all the way down to the very end. Okay. Now I said that axons are typically relatively unbranched. Sometimes axons have a branch called an axon collateral. Okay, this picture just cuts it off, but all of this would be also going in this direction. Okay. Axons can be super, super long. Okay. For example, the neurons that are stimulated like when you tickle your toes. Okay. Tickle your bottom of your toes, you're going to be stimulating dendrites of a neuron. The cell body is going to be located right there as well. The axon is actually going to run all the way up from your toes and connect your spinal cord. So I'm talking several feet. Okay, think about how far it is from your toes to your spinal cord. Okay. At the end of an axon are some more things that kind of look like tree branches, which we call axon terminals. Okay. Axon terminals or telodendria are small branches located at the distal end of the axon, terminating as what we call a synaptic knob. Okay. Each of these little fattened structures is either called a synaptic end bulb or a knob, same thing. This is what they look like inside, full of bubbles called synaptic vesicles. And inside of those vesicles are chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that can stimulate another neuron or a gland cell or a muscle cell, triggering things like gland secretion or muscle contraction, so on and so forth. Things that we'll talk about later on in this lecture, but aren't going to get there today. Now, for the next couple slides, I want to talk about the ways that we classify neurons. The first of which is called the structural classification. Let me grab a real quick. Hang on. Grab a scratch piece of paper so I can draw, hopefully anyway, what these look like. All right, so let's draw them out, and I'm going to draw them really simply, kind of like a stick figure style neuron. But we've got a multipolar, if I could spell, unipolar, and a bipolar. A multipolar neuron is actually what was shown there on that slide that I was showing you and pointing things out. It's got the cell body and then a whole bunch of these, tree branch looking like dendrites plus an axon. Okay. Multi because it's got multiple. It's at least 3, but in many cases probably a heck of a lot more than that. Extensions. Okay. A unipolar neuron, it's going to look like this. Where you've got the cell body connected to one little branch, because uni means what? And then that branch goes one direction, and that branch from that goes the other direction. These would be the dendrites. These will be the axon terminals. Okay. Bi means what? 2. Bipolar neurons look like that, where the cell body is in between 1, 2 extensions. As far as their prominence in our body, multipolar are by far the most common, and that's why this is the picture that was chosen. Okay, multipolar neuron. Okay, these are the ones that you find in our brain predominantly. These are the ones that also actually send out signals that cause our muscles to contract. Okay. Unipolar neurons are typically associated with sensations. Okay. Sensations like itch and tickle and hot and cold, meaning that they carry signals into our central nervous system, either into our spinal cord or into our brain. Okay. Bipolar neurons are very rare, not as in like some people have them and others don't, just not very many of them. Okay, they're only found as specialized sensory neurons in our eyes, our ears, and the olfactory organs, which would be our nose. Okay. Anybody ever heard of rods and cones? Rods and cones are in your eyes, right? Okay, help with vision. Rods and cones are a form of bipolar neuron, and containing 2 processes. They are also, they're also sensory in function like these, but when you're carrying sensations into our spinal cord, typically it's this way because they're a lot more prominent. They carry signals in for a lot more sensations than just smell, hearing, balance, and sight. Okay, so that's the way to classify neurons structurally. You can also classify them functionally based on the direction of nerve impulse traveling, based on which direction the nerve impulse is going, in other words. Okay, we've seen the word sensory and afferent here just a few minutes ago when we talked about the two-lane highway that I was discussing. And we said afferent or sensory refers to incoming information. Once again, it's always relative to the central nervous system. So sensory afferent neurons are going to transmit impulses from sensory receptors toward or into the central nervous system. And almost all of these sensory neurons are unipolar in structure and are found in the sensory ganglia outside the central nervous system, as illustrated here in this picture on the next page. Okay, where we've got purple here box representing the peripheral nervous system, the tan box representing, either the brain or spinal cord, central nervous system. Here's one of those unipolar neurons. Maybe this sensation is itch, maybe it's tickle, whatever, doesn't matter. Okay, it's carrying the signal into the CNS. Notice which direction the action potential is pointing. Now, if this was smell or vision, it would not be a unipolar neuron, it would be a bipolar neuron. Okay. Motor neurons are the essentially exact opposite of a sensory neuron. They're down here. Notice this is a multipolar neuron structurally. Motor or efferent neurons are going to carry impulses away from the CNS to what we call effector organs. Remember, effectors are either going to be muscles or glands typically. And remember, there's three types of muscle: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay. The cell bodies of these neurons are located in the central nervous system, whereas the axon runs out towards the effectors. Now, do you guys remember what the prefix inter means? Inter means between. Interneurons are located between sensory and motor neurons. Notice interneurons are located entirely within the central nervous system. They are multipolar in structure. Okay. These are the ones that make up our brain and spinal cord predominantly, which is why your brain and spinal cord are by far and away the biggest structures of the nervous system. Interneurons are the predominant neurons in the body, 99%. There's also a way to describe them as association neurons. Really, I like the term interneurons a lot better. And that's because of what they do. They lie between motor and sensory neurons in the neural pathway. These are the ones that are involved with high-level processing, what we call integration. Okay. Remember, we provide input to our central nervous system. If we're thinking like a feedback loop, okay, you touch something hot, signal comes in, we decide what to do with that information, okay, which triggers a response, right? Okay, like when we touch something hot, we have to remove our hand from it. Okay, well, we can't remove our hand from it without signaling here to eventually here. The high level thinking, processing takes place here. We provide output here, and the response takes place thanks to the effectors. Or like when we're just hot in general or cold, you know what we do? We shiver when it's cold, like today, or last week when it was 1,000,000 degrees. We sweated. Okay. Make sense? Clear as mud, right?
Right.
So those are the kind of really functional cells of the nervous system. You've also got accessory non-excitable supporting cells called neuroglia. Neuroglia are non-excitable, which means that they do not create action potentials. They're not going to send signals in the body. They will help with supporting signaling in some cases, but they aren't what create and transmit that signal. Yeah. We're going to stop here because it's almost time to go. We don't have enough time to get through this slide, so we'll start with the 4 neuroglia of the central nervous system next week.